They had been taught that American soldiers would experiment on the sick, that wounded prisoners would become test subjects for brutal medical trials. So when Greta collapsed in the barracks of Camp Ruston, Louisiana, in September 1945, her fellow German POWs did the only thing they thought would save her. They formed a human wall around her dying body and screamed at the approaching American medics, "Don't touch her! She's dying! Leave her alone!" What happened next would shatter everything they believed about their captors. If this story moves you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. Camp Ruston sat in the pine forests of northern Louisiana, a sprawling collection of wooden barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The summer heat of 1945 had finally broken, giving way to cooler September mornings that brought fog rolling through the trees. The camp had been built to house thousands of German prisoners of war, mostly men captured in North Africa and Europe. But in one isolated corner, separated by an additional fence, stood the women's compound. 347 German women lived here. They were not soldiers. They were Helferinnen, the female auxiliaries who had served the Wehrmacht as radio operators, clerks, nurses, telephone switchboard workers, and administrative staff. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, these women found themselves swept up in the chaos of surrender. The Allies had no clear protocol for them. They were not quite soldiers, not quite civilians. After months in makeshift holding camps in Europe, they were shipped across the Atlantic to America. The barracks were simple wooden structures, each housing 40 women in double-stacked bunks. The building smelled of fresh pine and disinfectant, a sharp contrast to the damp, moldy cellars where many had spent the final months of the war in Germany. There were real mattresses here, thin but clean. Real blankets, rough wool but warm. Windows with glass that actually closed. For women who had survived the bombing of Berlin, the siege of Dresden, and the nightmare retreat from the Eastern Front, Camp Ruston felt almost comfortable. Almost. The Louisiana air smelled different from anything the German women had known. It was thick and sweet, heavy with the scent of magnolia blossoms and pine sap. At night, crickets sang so loudly it sounded like a symphony. Mosquitoes were a constant torment, drilling through the window screens, leaving welts on pale German skin that had never encountered such insects. The heat, even in September, was oppressive to women raised in the cool climates of Northern Europe. But it was the sounds that unsettled them most. Not the sounds of war, no sirens, no explosions, no screaming, but the sounds of American normalcy. A radio in the guard station playing jazz music, trucks rumbling past carrying supplies, the distant laughter of male prisoners from the main camp during their recreation time, the casual banter of American guards who joked with each other in English the women barely understood. It was all so ordinary, so peaceful, so completely wrong for people who had spent years in a state of total war. The women reacted to their imprisonment in different ways. Some, the younger ones mostly, adapted quickly. They were grateful to be alive, grateful for food and shelter, grateful to be far from the ruins of Germany. They learned English phrases from the guards, smiled politely, did their assigned work without complaint. To them, captivity was survival, and survival was enough. Others remained rigid with suspicion and fear. These were the older women, the ones who had served longer, who had lost more. They remembered the propaganda films shown in Germany, the lurid warnings about American brutality. They remembered being told that Americans were savages who would rape German women, torture prisoners, conduct inhuman medical experiments. These women kept to themselves, spoke only German, and watched the American guards with eyes full of distrust. Among this second group was Greta Müller. She was 32 years old, which made her one of the older women in the camp. She had served as a senior communications officer in the Luftwaffe, coordinating radio traffic for fighter squadrons. Greta was tall, thin, with sharp features and gray eyes that seemed to look right through people. She rarely smiled. She spoke to the American guards only when absolutely necessary, and even then with clipped, formal politeness that made it clear she despised them. Greta had two close friends in the camp, Helga, a former army nurse who had treated wounded soldiers on the Eastern Front, and Lisi, a younger woman who had worked as a clerk in occupied France. The three of them shared a bunk section in Barracks 7. They ate together, worked together, and spent their evenings sitting on the barrack steps, speaking in low German about their lost homeland and the families they had not heard from in months. They trusted each other, they trusted no one else, especially not the Americans. It started with a cough. Just a small, dry cough that Greta tried to suppress during evening roll call. This was early September, the weather still warm, but with hints of the cooler autumn to come. Helga noticed first. She'd been a nurse long enough to recognize when a cough was more than just a cough. "How long have you had that?" Helga asked one evening as they sat on their bunks. "A few days," Greta said, waving it off. "It's nothing. The air here is too wet. My lungs don't like it." But it got worse. Within a week, Greta was coughing so hard she could barely sleep. Her face grew pale, then flushed with fever. She began to sweat through her clothes at night, soaking her blanket. She refused to go to the camp infirmary. "I'm not letting those Americans touch me," she said through gritted teeth. "You know what they do to sick prisoners. I've heard the stories." Helga tried to convince her. "Greta, you need medicine. This is pneumonia, maybe worse. I've seen it before. If you don't get antibiotics—" "No." Greta's voice was sharp, final. "They'll experiment on me. Use me for their tests. I won't give them the chance." This belief was not paranoia. It was based on what the women had been told for years. Nazi propaganda had painted a vivid picture of American military medicine. Doctors who performed unnecessary surgeries on prisoners to practice techniques, who tested experimental drugs on unwilling subjects, who let prisoners die to observe the progression of disease. The propaganda was fiction, but the women had no way of knowing that. To them, it was fact, and Greta believed it absolutely. Helga did what she could with almost nothing. She had no medicines, no equipment, nothing but the knowledge in her head from her nursing training. She made Greta drink as much water as possible, trying to keep her hydrated. She begged extra blankets from other women to keep Greta warm through the fever chills. She stayed awake at night, watching Greta's breathing, terrified each time it became shallow and labored. Lisa helped however she could. She brought Greta her meals from the dining hall, trying to coax her to eat even when Greta had no appetite. She sat with her during the worst coughing fits, holding her upright so she could breathe. The other women in the barracks noticed but said nothing. In the strange hierarchy of the prison camp, you didn't interfere in someone else's business unless asked. For 2 weeks, Helga managed to keep Greta's condition hidden from the camp authorities. The daily roll calls were conducted quickly, just a head count. As long as Greta could stand upright for 5 minutes twice a day, the guards didn't look too closely. The work assignments were light, mostly cleaning duties, laundry, kitchen help, and Helga and Lise covered for Greta, doing her share along with their own. But Greta was dying. Helga knew it with the certainty of her medical training. The fever was constant now, burning at 104 degrees. The cough had turned wet and productive, bringing up blood-streaked phlegm. Greta's breathing came in short, gasping pants. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint from lack of oxygen. She was drowning in fluid in her own lungs, and without antibiotics, without oxygen, without real medical care, there was nothing Helga could do. It happened during afternoon roll call on September 22nd, 1945. The women were lined up outside Barrack 7, standing in neat rows, while a bored American corporal counted heads. Greta stood between Helga and Lisa, barely able to stay upright. Her face was gray, her eyes glassy with fever. She swayed on her feet. 57, 58. The corporal worked his way down the line, clipboard in hand, not really looking at the women's faces. Greta's knees buckled. She would have hit the ground hard, but Helga caught her, wrapping both arms around her friend's waist. "I've got you," Helga whispered in German. "Just a few more seconds." The corporal looked up at the commotion. "Everything okay there?" "Fine," Lisa said quickly in heavily accented English. "She is fine, just tired." The corporal shrugged and went back to counting. Roll call finished, the women were dismissed. Helga and Lisa half-carried, half-dragged Greta back into the barracks. They laid her on her bunk. She was barely conscious now, her breathing a horrible rattling sound. "We have to get help," Lisa said, her voice breaking with panic. "Helga, she's dying. Look at her." "I know," Helga said. She was crying now, tears running down her face. "But if we call the Americans, she'll never forgive us. She made me promise. She said she'd rather die." "And what if she does die?" Lisa grabbed Helga's shoulders, forcing her to make eye contact. "What if we just sit here and watch her die because we're too scared to ask for help?" They sat there for an hour, frozen by indecision. Around them, the other women in the barracks went about their evening routines. Some wrote letters, some played cards, some just lay on their bunks, staring at the ceiling. Everyone knew what was happening in the corner bunk, but no one said anything. It wasn't their business, and besides, they understood. They had all heard the same propaganda about American medical experiments. If Greta would rather die than submit to that, well, that was her choice. At 7 p.m., Greta stopped breathing, just stopped. Her chest went still, her lips turned blue. Helga screamed. It was a raw animal sound of pure terror. She put her ear to Greta's chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat. There it was, faint but still there. Greta's heart was still beating, but she wasn't breathing. Helga did the only thing she could. She tilted Greta's head back, pinched her nose, and breathed into her mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Greta's chest rose and fell with the forced air, but she didn't start breathing on her own. "Get help!" Helga screamed at Lisa between breaths. "Run! Get the Americans! I don't care anymore! Just get help!" Lisa ran. She burst out of the barracks and sprinted toward the guard station, screaming in broken English. "Help! Doctor! Woman dying! Please help!" Behind her in the barracks, the other German women gathered around Greta's bunk. And without any discussion, without any planning, they made a decision. If the Americans were coming, they would protect Greta, even if it was too late, even if she was already dying. They would not let the Americans take her without a fight. The American medical team arrived within 5 minutes of Lisa's frantic call. There were 3 of them: Captain James Morrison, the camp's chief medical officer, a 38-year-old doctor from Boston; Corporal Danny Martinez, a medic who had served in field hospitals across France and Germany; and Private First Class Sarah Chen, one of the few female medics in the U.S. Army, assigned to the women's camp specifically because the Army thought female prisoners might be more comfortable with a woman treating them. They came running, carrying a stretcher and a medical kit. Captain Morrison had been in the middle of dinner when the call came. He still had his napkin tucked into his collar. He'd treated thousands of wounded soldiers over the past 3 years. He'd performed surgery in bombed-out buildings, amputated limbs in foxholes, held dying men's hands in field hospitals under artillery fire. He wasn't a man who rattled easily, but what he saw when he entered Barracks 7 stopped him in his tracks. 40 German women had formed a human barrier around one of the bunks. They stood shoulder to shoulder, 3 rows deep, creating a solid wall of bodies. Their faces were hard, hostile, afraid. Several were crying. Some had picked up whatever they could find to use as weapons: broom handles, metal cups, a chair leg. They looked like they were prepared to fight to the death. And they were screaming. All of them in a chorus of German and broken English. "Don't touch her. She's dying. Leave her alone. You will not experiment on her. Get away. Don't come closer." Captain Morrison raised his hands, palms out, in a gesture of peace. "We're here to help," he said clearly, loudly, hoping his calm tone would get through even if they didn't understand all the words. "We're doctors. We want to help your friend." "Liar!" one of the women shouted in German. Another translated into English. "You want to use her. Experiment. We know what you do." Behind the wall of women, Morrison could see Helga still performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation on the dying woman. He could hear the terrible wet rattle of fluid in her lungs each time Helga forced air into her. The woman was drowning. She needed intubation, oxygen, antibiotics, intravenous fluids. She needed emergency medical care, and she needed it right now, or she would be dead in minutes. "Please," Morrison said. He took one step forward. The women surged toward him, raising their makeshift weapons. He stopped. "Please, I'm a doctor. I've taken an oath to help people. I don't want to hurt your friend. I want to save her. But I can't do that from over here." Corporal Martinez leaned close to Morrison and whispered, "Sir, we could call for backup. Get guards in here to move them." "No," Morrison said immediately. "That will make it worse. Look at them. They're terrified. They think we're going to hurt her. If we force our way in, they'll never trust us. And that woman will die while we're fighting our way through." He turned to Private Chen. "Sarah, you try. Maybe they'll listen to another woman." Private Sarah Chen stepped forward. She was 24 years old, born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrant parents. She had enlisted in 1943 and fought hard to be allowed into medical training at a time when the Army barely accepted women in any role. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with a round face and gentle eyes. She looked completely non-threatening, which was exactly what Morrison was counting on. Sarah set down her medical kit and raised her empty hands. She spoke in English, but slowly, clearly, hoping they would understand at least some of it. "My name is Sarah. I'm a nurse. I have medicine that can help your friend. Please, let me try." The women didn't move, but they stopped shouting. That was something. Sarah tried again. She pointed to her medical kit. "Medicine," she said. Then she made a gesture of someone breathing easily. "Help her breathe. Save her life." Then she placed both hands over her heart. "Please, trust me. I want to help." Lisa stood at the front of the group of women. She had been watching Sarah's face, and what she saw there didn't look like cruelty or deception. It looked like genuine concern. Genuine desperation, even. This American woman looked like she truly wanted to help. Lisa turned to the women behind her and spoke rapidly in German. "Look at her face. She's not lying. And Greta is dying right now. In the next few minutes. We can let her die to protect her from something that might not even be real, or we can take a chance." "They'll hurt her," someone shouted. "She's already dead if we do nothing," Lisa shouted back. "Look at Helga. Look how exhausted she is. Greta hasn't breathed on her own in 5 minutes. This is her only chance." The women looked at each other. Fear fought with hope in their eyes. Years of propaganda fought with the desperate desire to save their friend. Finally, slowly, the wall began to part. Just a narrow gap at first, then wider. But as Sarah Chen stepped forward to enter the gap, one woman grabbed her arm. It was an older woman, maybe 50, with steel-gray hair and hard eyes. She spoke in German, but her meaning was clear from her tone and her grip on Sarah's arm. A warning. A threat. Lisa translated. She says, "If you hurt her, if you do experiments, if you cause her pain, we will kill you. All of us. We don't care what happens to us. We will kill you." Sarah looked the older woman directly in the eyes. "I understand," she said. "If I hurt her, you can kill me. But I won't hurt her, I promise." The woman released Sarah's arm. Sarah walked through the gap in the wall of women. Behind her, Captain Morrison and Corporal Martinez followed, carrying their equipment. The German women closed ranks behind them. Now the Americans were surrounded, trapped inside the circle. If things went wrong, there would be no easy escape. Morrison knelt beside the bunk and immediately began his assessment. He didn't need more than 10 seconds to diagnose the problem. Severe pneumonia, probably bacterial, with complete respiratory failure. The woman's lips were blue, her fingernails purple. Her pulse was thready and weak. She was minutes from death. "Danny, start an IV," Morrison snapped. "Normal saline, wide open. Sarah, I need the intubation kit. Now." Helga, still kneeling beside Greta, looked up at Morrison with exhausted, desperate eyes. "Please," she whispered in English. It was perhaps the only English word she knew. "Please." "I've got her," Morrison said. He placed his hand on Helga's shoulder, gently moving her aside. "You did good keeping her alive this long. You did real good. Now let me help." He worked fast. IV line in, fluids running, endotracheal tube down her throat, connected to an oxygen bag that Martinez began squeezing rhythmically, forcing air into her lungs. Injection of adrenaline to stimulate her heart. Injection of penicillin, the miracle drug that had saved thousands of soldiers from infections like this. The German women watched in absolute silence. They had expected rough handling, pain, cruelty. Instead, they saw careful, precise movements. Gentle hands. 3 Americans working together like a machine, each knowing exactly what to do. And they saw something else. Sweat on Morrison's forehead, tension in his jaw, desperation in his eyes. He wasn't experimenting. He was fighting. Fighting to save Greta's life as hard as he would fight to save anyone's life. It took 3 minutes of manual ventilation, 3 minutes of forcing oxygen into her fluid-filled lungs, before Greta's color started to change. The blue tint faded from her lips. The purple left her fingernails. Her heart rate, visible on the pulse in her neck, grew stronger, steadier. And then, miracle of miracles, she coughed. It was a weak cough, more like a gag, but it was her body's own reflex, her own attempt to breathe. Morrison saw it and allowed himself the smallest smile. "That's it," he said softly. "That's good. Come on. Breathe for me. You can do it." Greta's eyes fluttered open. They were unfocused, clouded with fever and confusion, but they were open. She was alive. She was conscious. She was breathing, even if it was with the help of the tube and the oxygen bag. Helga burst into tears. Not quiet tears, but huge, racking sobs of relief. Lisa grabbed her, hugged her, and started crying too. Around them, the other German women began to cry as well, the tension breaking all at once. Some sat down on the floor, their legs giving out. Others hugged each other. A few just stood there, staring, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Morrison looked up at the crowd of women surrounding him. "She's stable," he said, "but she needs to go to the hospital. Real hospital, with x-rays and real oxygen and antibiotics. We need to move her, right now." This time, when the Americans lifted Greta onto the stretcher, no one tried to stop them. The women parted silently, watching as the medical team carried their friend out of the barracks. But Helga and Lisa followed. They weren't letting Greta out of their sight. Not yet. They had to see this through. The base hospital was a real medical facility, not just a field hospital. It was a large building with electricity, running water, proper operating rooms, x-ray machines, and wards full of beds. It primarily served American military personnel, but it also treated civilian employees and, when necessary, prisoners of war. Helga and Lise were allowed to stay in the waiting room while Greta was taken to the emergency ward. They sat on hard wooden benches, still in their prison camp clothes, surrounded by American soldiers and nurses hurrying past. No one paid them much attention. They were just 2 more people waiting for news about someone they loved. Captain Morrison came out after an hour. He looked tired but satisfied. "She's going to live," he said. Lisa translated for Helga, who burst into fresh tears. "The pneumonia is bad, but we caught it in time. She'll need to stay here for at least a week, maybe 2. We need to pump her full of penicillin, drain the fluid from her lungs, make sure the infection doesn't come back. But she'll live." "Can we see her?" Lisa asked. Morrison hesitated. "She's unconscious. We have her sedated so she doesn't fight the breathing tube, but yes, you can see her for a few minutes." He led them to a small room where Greta lay in a real hospital bed. She looked tiny and frail in the white sheets. The breathing tube was still in her throat, connected to a machine that hissed and clicked as it pushed air into her lungs. IV lines ran into both arms. Her face was peaceful in unconsciousness, the gray pallor fading as oxygen and fluids worked through her system. Helga approached the bed slowly, almost reverently. She reached out and touched Greta's hand. It was warm. Alive. She looked up at Morrison with tears streaming down her face and said in halting English, "Thank you. Thank you." Morrison smiled. "You're welcome. Now you two need to get some rest. Come back tomorrow. She should be awake by then. When Helga and Lisa returned to the camp that night, the other women mobbed them with questions. What happened? Is Greta alive? What did the Americans do to her? Did they hurt her? Lisa stood on a chair in the middle of the barracks and told them everything. She described the hospital, the machines, the medicine, the gentle way the doctors had treated Greta. She described Morrison's face, the genuine concern she had seen there. She described how he had fought to save Greta's life as if she were his own sister. They didn't hurt her, Lisa said. They saved her. We were wrong. Everything we were told about the Americans. It was lies. All lies. The barracks erupted in conversation. Some women wanted to believe it immediately, relief flooding through them. Others were skeptical, the older ones especially. They had spent too long believing the propaganda to let it go easily. Maybe they're just being nice because we're women, one woman said. Maybe they treat the male prisoners differently. Or maybe, Helga said quietly, maybe everything our government told us was a lie. About everything. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. If the Americans weren't monsters, if they were actually honorable people who treated prisoners with dignity and medical care, then what did that say about Germany? What did it say about the war? What did it say about everything they had believed and fought for? The next day, Captain Morrison allowed Helga and Lise to visit Greta again. This time she was awake. The breathing tube had been removed. She could speak, though her voice was hoarse and weak. When Greta saw them enter the room, she burst into tears. "You let them take me," she whispered. "I told you not to. I told you what they would do." Helga sat on the edge of the bed and took Greta's hand. "Look around you," she said gently. "Look at this room. Look at these machines. Look at the medicine they're giving you. Does this look like torture to you?" Greta looked. She saw the IV drip feeding antibiotics into her arm. She saw the oxygen mask hanging ready beside the bed. She saw the clean white sheets, the comfortable mattress, the window with real glass showing blue sky outside. She saw Private Sarah Chen standing in the doorway, checking her chart with a look of professional concern. "They saved your life," Lisa said. "You were dead. Your heart was still beating, but you weren't breathing. Another few minutes and you would have been gone. The American doctor, Captain Morrison, he brought you back. He used medicine we don't have in Germany anymore. He used skills and equipment to save you. And he did it because he's a doctor, and that's what doctors do." Greta closed her eyes. Tears leaked from under her eyelids. "They told us the Americans were animals," she whispered. "They told us we would be better off dead than in American hands." "They lied," Helga said simply. "About this, maybe about everything." On the third day of Greta's hospitalization, Captain Morrison sat down with Helga and Lise in the hospital cafeteria. He bought them coffee and sandwiches, which they accepted hesitantly. They still weren't entirely comfortable being treated as equals by an American officer. "I want to understand something," Morrison said. "Why did you think we would hurt her? Where did that idea come from?" Lisa, whose English was the best of the three, tried to explain. "In Germany, we were shown films. We were told stories about American doctors who do experiments on prisoners, who let prisoners die to watch what happens, who are cruel and evil." Morrison's face darkened. "That's not true. That's not even close to true. I took an oath when I became a doctor. First, do no harm. It doesn't matter if the patient is American or German, soldier or civilian, friend or enemy. When someone needs medical care, I provide it. Period." "But the films," Lisa started. "Propaganda," Morrison said flatly. "Lies designed to make you fear us. And it worked, didn't it? It almost cost your friend her life." Helga spoke up in German. Lisa translated. "She wants to know, why do you help us? We were your enemy. We fought against you. Some of us..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Some of us did terrible things, or helped people who did terrible things. Why help us?" Morrison was quiet for a moment, thinking. "Because the war is over," he finally said. "You're not my enemy anymore. You're just people who need help. And because I have to believe, that we're better than the people we fought against. That we prove we're better not by how we treat our friends, but by how we treat our enemies. If I become cruel just because I have the power to be cruel, then what did we even fight for?" He leaned forward, his voice intense. "You want to know what the real difference is between us and the Nazis? It's not that we're stronger or smarter or braver. It's that we believe every human life has value, even yours. Even the lives of people who fought against us. That belief, that's what we were fighting for. And I'll be damned if I'm going to abandon it now that the fighting is over." The conversation spread through the women's camp like wildfire. Lisa told everyone what Morrison had said, and slowly, painfully, the women began to reconsider everything they had been taught. It wasn't easy. Propaganda doesn't release its grip easily. For years they had been told that Germany was good and America was evil. that Germans were superior and Americans were inferior, that their cause was just and their enemies were monsters. To accept that all of this was false meant accepting that they had been lied to by their own government, their own leaders, their own people. Some women rejected it entirely. They retreated deeper into their old beliefs, insisting that the Americans were just cleverly hiding their true nature, that the kindness was a trap, that the moment the women let their guard down, the brutality would begin. But most of them began to change. They started looking at the Americans differently. They noticed things they had ignored before. The guards who smiled and said good morning, the kitchen staff who gave them extra portions of food, the officers who treated them with basic human respect, the doctors who saved lives without question. And they started to talk about Germany, about what they had seen there in the final years of the war, about the brutality of their own government toward its own people, about the food rationing that left children starving while Nazi officials ate well, about the executions of anyone who questioned the regime, about the way their own government had used them, sent them into danger, and then abandoned them when defeat came. One evening, a young woman named Ingrid spoke up during a barrack discussion. "My brother was executed," she said quietly. "In 1944, he said the war was lost and we should surrender. Someone reported him. They hanged him in the town square as a traitor. That was our government, our people. And we thought the Americans were the monsters?" Greta was released from the hospital after 12 days. She walked back into Barrack 7 looking like a different person. She had gained weight, her face had color, she could breathe without pain, she looked healthy, alive. The women welcomed her back with cheers and tears and hugs. They asked her about the hospital, about the treatment, about the Americans. And Greta, who had been the most suspicious of all of them, who had refused treatment even to the point of death, told them the truth. "I was wrong," she said. She stood in the center of the barracks, speaking clearly so everyone could hear. "I was wrong about the Americans. They saved my life. They used medicine I didn't even know existed. They treated me with kindness and respect. The nurses checked on me every hour. The doctors explained everything they were doing. They asked my permission before procedures. They treated me like a human being." She paused, her voice breaking slightly. "I would have died believing a lie. I would have died hating people who didn't deserve hatred. I would have died without ever knowing that the enemy I had been taught to fear was actually trying to save me." After Greta's return, something shifted in the women's camp. The walls came down. Not the physical walls of barbed wire and guard towers, but the psychological walls of fear and mistrust. Women started talking to the guards in broken English. They asked questions about America, about the guards' families, about normal life. The guards who had maintained professional distance began to relax as well. They showed the women photographs of their wives and children. They shared candy and gum. They taught English phrases and learned a few German words in return. Private Sarah Chen became a regular visitor to the women's barracks. She brought medical supplies and taught basic first aid. But more than that, she became a friend. She ate meals with the women, played cards with them, shared stories about her life in California. The women were fascinated by her, a woman of color, an American, a soldier. Everything about her contradicted what they had been taught about American racial policies and women's roles. In Germany, one woman said to Sarah one day, "We were told America hates people who look different. But you are a soldier. You are respected." Sarah laughed, but it was a bitter laugh. "America isn't perfect," she said honestly. "There's racism here too. My parents were put in internment camps during the war just for being Japanese American. I face discrimination every day. But the difference is we're trying to get better. We're working on it. We believe in the idea that all men are created equal, even if we don't always live up to it." This honesty impressed the women more than any propaganda could have. Sarah wasn't pretending America was perfect. She was admitting its flaws while still believing in its ideals. That nuance, that complexity was something they had never encountered in German propaganda, which had always painted everything in black and white. The real turning point came one evening when Captain Morrison gave a lecture to the entire women's camp. He had been invited by the camp commander to explain the Geneva Convention and prisoner rights. He stood in front of 300 German women and explained in clear, simple terms what the rules said about how prisoners should be treated. "You have the right to adequate food, clean water, and shelter," he said. "You have the right to medical care. You have the right to send and receive letters. You have the right to be treated with human dignity. These aren't favors we're doing you. These are rights, guaranteed by international law, that we are required to honor." One woman raised her hand. "Why?" she asked. "Why do you follow these rules? You won the war. You have the power. You could do whatever you want to us. Why do you follow rules?" Morrison smiled. "Because that's what separates civilization from barbarism," he said. "Power without rules is tyranny. We follow the rules not because we have to, but because we choose to. Because we believe that how we treat the powerless says more about us than how we treat the powerful." The women sat in silence, processing this. Many were crying, because they understood what he wasn't saying directly, that their own government had not followed these rules, that German POW camps had been places of horror and death. that the very things Morrison described as basic human rights had been denied to prisoners in German hands. They had served a regime that had treated human beings as disposable, and now they were being treated with dignity by the people they had been taught to hate. The months that followed saw a complete transformation of the women's camp. The fear and hostility melted away. Women who had refused to speak English began taking lessons. Women who had kept to themselves began forming friendships with the American staff. The camp became less like a prison and more like a temporary community. Greta became something of a celebrity among both the prisoners and the guards. Everyone knew the story of her near death and dramatic rescue. But more than that, she became a bridge between the two groups. She started helping Private Chen in the infirmary, using her experience and intelligence to assist with medical care for the other prisoners. She translated medical information, helped calm frightened patients, and advocated for the women's health needs. Helga and Lisa threw themselves into learning everything they could about America and American values. They read newspapers provided by the camp library. They attended lectures about democracy and the American system of government. They asked endless questions of anyone willing to answer. They were trying to understand how they had been so wrong about so much. Not all the women made this transition. Some remained bitter, convinced that American kindness was a trick or a sign of weakness. A small group of die-hard believers still insisted that Germany had been right and would rise again. But they were the minority now. Most of the women had accepted the reality of their situation and were trying to make the best of it. The mail from Germany painted a devastating picture. Cities destroyed, families homeless, children starving. The country divided between the Soviet and Western zones. People living in rubble, scrounging for food, burning furniture to stay warm. Greta received a letter from her sister in Munich. The letter was 4 pages of thin paper covered in cramped handwriting. It described how their parents' house had been destroyed in a bombing raid, how their father had died in the collapse, how their mother and sister were living in a basement with 6 other families, sharing 1 room, 1 blanket between them, how food was so scarce that they ate grass soup and considered it a feast. Greta sat on her bunk in Camp Ruston holding that letter and looked around. She had 3 meals a day, a warm bed, medical care, safety. Her family in Germany was starving in ruins, while she, the prisoner, lived in relative comfort. The guilt was crushing. She went to Captain Morrison and asked if there was any way to send food or supplies to her family. Morrison shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry. The mail system barely works. Packages don't get through. The best thing you can do is write to them. Let them know you're alive and safe. That will give them hope." So Greta wrote. She told her family she was healthy, well-fed, and treated kindly. She told them about the American doctor who had saved her life. She told them to hold on, to survive, because the war was truly over and things would eventually get better. She didn't tell them about the guilt she felt, about how she lay awake at night, warm and fed, thinking about them freezing and starving, about how she wished she could trade places with them. In February 1946, the announcement came. The German women, POWs, would be repatriated, sent home to Germany. The war had been over for 9 months. It was time for them to go back. The reaction was complicated. Some women were overjoyed. They wanted to see their families, to return to their homeland, to rebuild. But others were terrified. What were they going back to? Destroyed cities, starvation, occupation by foreign armies, and a population that would likely view them as traitors or failures for having survived when so many had died. Greta, Helga, and Lisa sat together on the barrack steps the night after the announcement, watching the Louisiana sunset. None of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Greta broke the silence. "I don't want to go back," she said quietly. "Is that terrible? Is that betraying my country?" "What country?" Helga said bitterly. "The country that sent us to war and then collapsed? The country that lied to us about everything? The country that's now rubble and ash?" "Our families are there," Lisa said. "We have to go back for them." "I know," Greta said. "I know we have to go. But part of me wishes we could stay here, where there's food and peace and people who treat us like human beings. Does that make me a coward?" "It makes you human," Helga said. The final weeks at Camp Ruston were bittersweet. The women prepared for their journey home, packing the few possessions they had. The American Camp Administration gave each woman a care package: chocolate, soap, canned food, warm clothing, small gifts to help them survive the journey in the first difficult weeks back in Germany. Captain Morrison came to say goodbye to Greta personally. "Take care of yourself," he said, shaking her hand. "You're a fighter. You'll survive whatever comes next." "Thank you," Greta said. She was crying. For everything. For saving my life. For showing me that not all people are what I was taught to believe. For treating me with dignity when you had every reason not to. Morrison smiled. "Just promise me something," he said. "When you get back to Germany, when you're rebuilding your country, remember this. Remember that we were enemies, but we still treated each other as human beings. Remember that peace is possible, and help build a Germany that chooses peace. I promise, Greta said, and she meant it. The women left Camp Ruston in March 1946. They boarded trains that would take them to the coast, then ships that would carry them across the Atlantic, back to a Germany they barely recognized. Most of them carried their care packages, those small tokens of American generosity, clutched close like precious treasures. Greta Müller returned to Munich and found her sister and mother living in the basement she had read about. She shared her care package with them, and that chocolate and canned food kept them alive through a brutal winter. She never stopped telling the story of the American doctor who saved her life. She told her children and eventually her grandchildren. In a 1989 interview, shortly before the fall of the Berlin Wall, an elderly Greta said, "I learned something in that American prison camp that I wish every German had learned. I learned that propaganda is poison. I learned that the people we're taught to hate are just people. I learned that mercy is not weakness, it's the highest form of strength. The Americans could have let me die. They could have experimented on me, as we had been told they would. Instead, they saved my life and asked nothing in return except that I remember their humanity. And I have. Every day for 44 years I have remembered." The story of the German women who formed a human shield around their dying friend, convinced they were protecting her from torture when they were actually preventing her rescue, became a powerful parable in post-war Germany. It illustrated how propaganda distorts reality, how fear can blind us to kindness, and how the hardest walls to tear down are the ones we build in our own minds. But perhaps the most important lesson was this, that even in the darkest times, even between the bitterest enemies, humanity can prevail. That compassion can exist alongside conflict, that a doctor's oath to do no harm transcends nationality and politics, that healing can happen not just for bodies, but for souls. The soap and medicine that saved Greta's life became more than physical objects. They became symbols of a different way of thinking. Symbols of a world where enemies could become healers, where prisoners could receive dignity, where the powerless could trust the powerful. This is the story of how 300 German women learned that the monsters they feared were actually human beings. And in learning that lesson, they found the courage to rebuild their country on a foundation of peace rather than hatred. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and subscribe to hear more true accounts from World War II. These stories, though buried in time, still speak to us today. They remind us that humanity can survive even the worst that history throws at us. And that's a lesson worth remembering.